Okay. So I'm Jennifer Hollinshead, and I'm the founder and clinical director of Peak Resilience, and extremely excited today to welcome for the second time, and it's going to be even better. It just keeps building on itself. Emily is going to be presenting all about climate anxiety and eco dread today. Emily Potts is our newest counselor on the team after completing her practicum, and she's just waiting on her license and all of that to be done. And one of the reasons why we brought you on the team, Emily, and I've learned an unbelievable amount already, is because of how much knowledge you have about the environment, but also how people's mental health can be impacted, knowing about how bad things are, basically. So I'll just get us started with a welcome land acknowledgement, because this is obviously a huge part of why we have climate problems is colonization and the impacts of colonization and land theft and occupation and resource extraction and genocide. So we recognize with a lot of humility and respect that we are on stolen ground right now, which is the Coast Salish peoples, Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh peoples' traditional territories that they've been taking care of for thousands of years. And so part of intersectional feminist therapy at Peak Resilience is to recognize how we've all been shaped and harmed and impacted by colonization, and how we can kind of decolonize our minds, ideally, so that we are less harmed and do less harm. So that is where I will leave Emily to get started on kind of a very alarming topic. And so this is a loaded, hard, scary topic. So thanks for trying to tackle it.
My pleasure.
Yeah, with
and
that, that's
thanks.
a segue.
Yeah. Thanks for the introduction. I appreciate it. So yeah, I'm just to kind of reiterate some things here. My name is Emily, and I use pronouns she, her. And I'm really, really lucky and privileged to call the West Coast of Canada my home. Grew up on Vancouver Island, and I'm a settler here on these lands as well. I'm the type of person who is a lot happier and has a much bigger smile when I'm outside versus inside. So the outdoors have been a big part of my life and have really shaped me into the person that I am today. Like Jennifer was saying, I recently graduated from my master's program in counseling psychology. And after a really rewarding and exciting practicum here at Peak, I'm happy to continue on as a full-time therapist here. And really, my hope is to dedicate my future in mental health towards supporting folks who struggle with concepts like eco-anxiety and climate dread, mostly because I'm also grappling with those own feelings myself. And it's been this kind of constant experience that I've had to move through. With that being said, I want to say too that I'm a facilitator, but by no means an expert in this topic. There's so much content on this, and I often feel very overwhelmed with like, how do we even start? Where do we build off of any of this? And I'm a professional, but I'm also learning. So there's always going to be that element of learning new things and reframing how I'm thinking about things here. I was hoping it would be okay just to read a little bit of writing too before we get started here about kind of why I was interested in this topic in the first place. It's a piece of writing that I did not too long ago, just about where my experience with climate anxiety started, and also how that led me to kind of where I am today working in mental health. So in order for us to fully understand that era, we have to go back to 2014. I was 21 years old, and I am an undergraduate student in climate science and conservation biology. So that's my previous life. And so I want to take you to my political ecology class where I first learned about kind of this feeling and this sensation of climate dread and climate anxiety in general. So I'll just read you this little piece of writing here. So March 2014, I'm 21, and I'm watching the guest lecturer in my political ecology class describe to us what a future in climate science will look like with jarring transparency. Depression, anxiety, and hopelessness are inevitable, really, in this line of work, he said. The best thing you can do is prepare yourself for it. The point of the lecture is to highlight the realities of our future career, the hard work that's required, but also how damn hard the work is. A part of me appreciates the realism, but I hope that the pit of anxiety that I feel forming in my stomach doesn't stick around for too long. I look around the class to see how my peers are reacting. Their eager, youthful faces also reflect feelings of deflation and worry. Most of us are dressed in recycled or thrifted clothes, wearing Blundstones and Birkenstocks proudly on our feet, with our reusable coffee mugs and mason jars of overnight oats placed on our desks. Bamboo utensils somehow a symbol of rebellion against all those single-use plastics. Rage and anxiety are not foreign emotions for us. In some sick way, it's kind of what fuels us, actually. But I'm wondering what our futures are going to look like when all of our rage quotas fill up. When I'm not in class, I'm walking through grocery stores, reading labels closely and questioning my dietary choices. I'm heading out late at night with friends to see what food we can find in the dumpster behind the local shop. I'm layering up in rain gear and fighting through the perpetual wetness of West Coast winter on my bike, constantly showing up to class a little damp, my wool sweater smelling always a little earthy. We tell each other that our actions matter when we're feeling discouraged. These are our daily protests. But I'm tired and sad and scared. I'm raging too, and I bring that rage with me wherever I go. The comment from the speaker is supposed to inspire us, but it feels like a slap across my day's face. I can feel my rage sink deep into the pit of my stomach and plant my first seed of hopelessness. A looming sense of dread occupies the remainder of my education until I'm able to collect that piece of paper declaring, "You did it," and run away from it all. I chase the spaces in between to try to distract myself, odd jobs that just barely pay food and rent, constantly reinventing my identity to experiment with what feels right, feeling drawn to live in a tent or a van, anything to get closer to nature. I'm searching for something I can't quite name. Eventually, I land a guiding job that allows me the opportunity to travel and be outside all the time. I know I'm happiest when I'm outside, always feeling unsettled by the containment of four walls. But saying yes to this job means stepping away from the environmental, low-footprint beliefs I'd fought so hard to establish. Staying would mean falling deeper into a void of hopelessness. I need to plant some new seeds that don't grow into anxiety trees. I need inspiration. I need a break from the idea that my future in climate work will be coupled with dread and anxiety. I want joy and hope. So, as you can imagine, a lot of things going through my head, a lot of concern and just guilt really around how I'm planning on moving through into this field. This little drawing here I actually did just the other day, and it really symbolizes this kind of like resting concerned face that I'm known for in my friends and family group. But more realistically, this is the kind of person that I really am when I'm outside and filled with laughter and hope and optimism and a ton of joy. So this is something that I also really want to bring into our talk, that both these emotions can exist at the same time, and they're both welcome and okay here. So what will we cover today? We'll talk a little bit about what climate anxiety is, who's most at risk. We'll talk a little bit about the symptoms of climate anxiety and eco-dread, what mental health looks like in a changing climate, first of all. And then we'll dive into some coping strategies. And I really want to dedicate quite a lot of time today to these coping strategies because I think they're really important to consider. We'll also get curious around understanding your emotions, how to connect in therapy, the intersections of climate anxiety and feminist theory, finding joy in climate action, and also resources for connection, which is a really key piece here. So first of all, I'm curious if everyone can just write quickly in the chat what on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being very little and 5 being I'm an expert, what is your experience around the topic of climate anxiety? Have you felt it? Do you know what I'm talking about when I even bring up this term? I just want to get a better understanding of where people are at with this topic here. Four, 2, yeah, 3, nice. Yeah, such a variation in people's knowledge and experience around this. I sometimes feel like I'm a 5, sometimes I feel like I'm a 1. I feel like I don't really know what's going on a lot of the time. Yeah, 2, thanks there, Kevin. So this is good. We've got a nice range. We've got this kind of experience as we move through this, and hopefully after the end of today, we'll have a bit more understanding and maybe fuel for conversation to talk about this kind of thing. So then let's start with the basics. Overall, there are a lot of terms that are being used to discuss the distress that people are experiencing in regards to the climate. Eco-anxiety, eco-grief, eco-paralysis, eco-guilt. These are all kind of interchangeable concepts. Today, for the most part, I'm going to be using this term climate anxiety, but I also might be using things like eco-dread as they're used interchangeably. So what is it? It's essentially the chronic fear and extreme worry of environmental harm caused by human activity and climate change. This fear can stem from direct experiences of severe weather, such as fires, floods, and droughts, ecological changes, and threatened safety to one's future and well-being. So fundamentally, climate anxiety is the distress that we experience about climate change and its impacts on the landscape and human experience. Right? So, so according to the Canadian Climate Institute, 3 in 4 Canadians feel that climate change impacts their mental health. So pretty staggering statistic here, and really demonstrates that you're not alone if you're thinking about this, and you're not alone if you're feeling this way. It's really, really relevant with what's going on right now. When we think about it, though, we also need to consider who might be more at risk, especially as we deal with kind of the disproportional effects of mental health in our world, in our environment. So marginalized communities are more at risk towards experiencing both the negative effects of climate change and also emotions around it. So the climate anxiety that shows up. Youth especially, we see a huge kickback in how youth are responding to changing climates, and also they're at the forefront of a lot of activist movements. First responders, right? So people who are fighting fires out there, people who are working in climate work in general, and mental health professionals. These folks are often more exposed to these feelings and more at risk. Elders, right? So we're looking at people who have maybe difficulty with breathing in the smoke that happens when forest fires come in. Indigenous communities especially are facing some serious impacts of climate change, and they are really at risk for climate anxiety too, and that kind of mental health component. And lastly, land workers, right? So farmers and conservation biologists and people who are working outside all the time and are noticing that their careers might be shifting as things start to change with our climate. So some of the symptoms of eco-anxiety, and these are by no means exhaustive, but just something to think about here. They can be fatalistic thinking, existential dread, grief and sadness over the loss of environment, right? So that kind of ambiguous grief that can show up too, of feeling sadness and feeling that there is a loss, but not really sure around what exactly. It can be very confusing sometimes. Feelings of depression, anxiety, or panic. Guilt, a lot of guilt related to the personal carbon footprint. I can definitely relate to this one. And just overall recurring thoughts about the climate. So again, these are some of the things that if you notice in yourself or in others, it might be expressions of eco-anxiety. There's a term actually coined by, this goes closely with the grief component there too, a term coined by Glenn Albrecht in 2007. It's called solastalgia. It's one of my favorite words. And it's a Latin word. It's a combination of a Latin word for comfort and a Greek word for pain. And it's a suffering or grief that describes the emotional distress people feel when environmental change impacts their environment. So it's often exacerbated by a sense of powerlessness and a lack of control. And it's further compounded by the increased flow of information about extreme events that we're getting from social media, which have become a regular fixture of news cycles for us. So the solastalgia component is essentially this sadness and grief around like homesickness, really missing home or missing what used to feel like home. So it's really interesting to see these new words start to emerge to describe these feelings that we maybe didn't have a few years ago. So mental health in a changing climate, super important to consider, especially from the feminist therapy lens. So as somebody who works from this lens, I'm always thinking about pathology and systems rather than people, right? So I want to zoom out and look at the big picture. Even though we're calling this concept anxiety, which is a disorder that's located in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, it's actually a pretty normal reaction to abnormal situations. So I do want to just point out the fact that this isn't necessarily a diagnosis or pathology. It's a pretty rational response to what's happening around us. There is, however, a difference in worry and anxiety. So many people are worried about climate change and the environment. However, worry elicits concern and action, whereas anxiety sometimes becomes debilitating, resulting in a full system shutdown. And that's not good, especially when we're thinking about how to take action. So really interesting to think about those two terms as we consider how we're feeling too. This concept of like impacted versus impaired, right? Are you really worried about something, or is it becoming to the point where you can't do anything about it because you're actually impaired by that stress and that anxiety? So climate anxiety is the heightened emotional, mental, or somatic distress that occurs in response to dangerous changes to the climate. I really like this expression or this definition because it looks at the emotional, mental, and somatic, right? Sometimes we might feel something emotionally, sometimes we might just feel something in our stomach, like that gut feeling I felt in my undergraduate class, that pit that just kind of stuck around for years. That was definitely my first indicator of a somatic response to anxiety showing up for me. So really important here is that our personal resilience is not the problem. If you have a complex set of feelings associated with the ongoing climate crisis, you're not alone. And also, arguably, these responses are highly adaptive to what's happening around you. So just wanted to take a minute to acknowledge that, because in a lot of these conversations around climate anxiety, it's shrugged off or seen as something that's not valid, but it totally makes sense. And there's a lot of space for it to occupy our space here. Okay, so that's all I'm going to talk about in terms of like the symptoms. And then I want to really make sure that we have some time here and some space to think about how we cope and how we move forward, and potentially have a bit of brainstorming if there's time. So first and most important thing in coping is getting to understand your emotions. A way we can do this is by using a resource from Climate Mental Health, developed by a researcher at the University of Helsinki, Panu Pakala. And they designed this climate emotions wheel that I personally really like. Sometimes in therapy, therapists may use an emotion wheel to get people starting to identify and name and understand what emotions are coming up. So rather than saying, I feel bad about something, saying like, yeah, I'm feeling some outrage. I'm feeling a ton of betrayal and disappointment. Or I'm feeling, panicky, like there's some overwhelm, there's some fear here. So again, this wheel is by no means exhaustive of all the different emotions that can show up when we think about climate change. But it is a good starting point to getting curious around how we're feeling and to start naming certain emotions that show up for you. So maybe if you could just write in the chat here too, it'd be great to hear what kind of emotions show up for you when you look at this wheel, or even beyond this wheel, when you think about climate and the changes that we're experiencing. And sometimes those emotions can be surprising, right? Like I sometimes exist a lot in that little blue zone there too of positivity. Sometimes I really hang out in the anger zone too. I'd love to hear what's showing up for you all here. Despair, despair and loneliness. Definitely. The loneliness can be so overwhelming sometimes. Despair and sadness, overwhelm. Yeah. Yeah. These are so real, right? They're so important and valid. And there is so much, we hear so much despair in a lot of the rhetoric around climate. And so it's a really important thing to hold space for. Yeah, loneliness, guilt, and overwhelm. That guilt piece is so, so relevant. I really feel that myself. And it can be really difficult to navigate. Um, Something too that I will dive into a little bit later is this concept in the blue zone around like hope and positivity, and being mindful to not silver line or sugarcoat or be a, kind of this eternal optimist around a lot of these things. That all of these emotions that you're sharing here, they are so valid and they deserve so much space and acknowledgement. And it's not always the goal to move into the blue zone, right? Yeah, sometimes hope, gratitude, and inspiration too, but it varies. It can shift so easily. Yes, thank you so much for saying that. It can shift, right? And even that loneliness piece that Romaine was saying there, sometimes just being in community with one another can really help feel like, there's some element of connection, some element of community. So again, we're starting to think about these emotions and how they show up for us, and the diversity of emotions, especially from moment to moment. I can say that in preparing this presentation, I was feeling a lot of hope and a lot of positivity and a ton of gratitude to be able to share these ideas in these spaces with you all. So that also makes me feel really connected, especially in those moments when I'm feeling maybe some of that overwhelm or the loneliness show up for me. Another way we can cope is by connecting our climate anxiety in the therapeutic space. So the Climate Mental Health Network is a really great resource that actually provides trainings and forums and connection for students and teachers and mental health professionals, and also can connect you to therapists that work specifically with this topic and have the understanding and awareness to have these conversations that might be a little bit more nuanced and difficult to have. In order to talk about climate anxiety in the therapeutic space, though, just like anything else, it's got to be safe, right? So we got to create a space that is free of judgment and free of stigma in order for us to explore some of these more complex emotions. Something that was really difficult for me back when I was that 21-year-old in my political ecology class was feeling like if I said I was anxious about the state of the climate, that was dismissed as something that's not really real or not a true anxiety. And so it took me a long time to feel like I was in a space where that was validated and that was really reasonable reason to come to therapy in the first place, to talk about some of these bigger things. So safety is super important before we can dive into these topics. And also, this is more tailored to the therapists listening in, is making sure that we are tailoring the therapeutic interventions to the individual. And so getting curious about where they're at in their climate journey and how they can best, connect and what they need from us. So again, not having that one size fits all approach, but rather getting really curious about what does that person need and what situation are they in? What systems are operating around them? What's maybe blocking them from having access to help and support around this? Okay. So, how does climate anxiety and feminist therapy intersect? Um, there are a lot of things that intersect in this way. A term that comes up is ecofeminism. So this is a term that is used every once in a while when we're talking about, the feminist approach to environmentalism. And it's essentially an ideology and movement that sees climate change, gender inequality, and social injustice more broadly as intrinsically related issues. And so the concept and belief is that these issues are all tied to a narrative of dominance in society. So specifically, ecofeminism holds the idea that environmental issues can be traced back to the global prioritization of qualities of oppression and domination, right? So take, oppress, oppress, oppress. These things are connected, and there's a lot of that we're seeing in um, the whole environmental movement as well, and how we relate to nature in general. Uh, I was actually just sent this really beautiful quote this morning by my mom. She knew I was doing this presentation, and it was something along the lines of the difference between like and love is when you like a flower, you pick it, and when you love a flower, you water it. I thought that was a really beautiful analogy of how we connect and support and nurture nature and ourselves, right? So it's really connected in that sense. So ecofeminist principles have kind of four main concepts that I think relate really nicely to climate anxiety. First one being that the oppression of marginalized groups and the oppression of nature are connected by similar forces of dominance and control. And we need to move away from a culture of dominance and towards an ethic of care in order for any kind of change to happen. All forms of oppression are unacceptable and interconnected. So we got to get curious about how all of these topics are coming together. And lastly, understanding these connections is essential for equitable change. So I know that a lot of these things are pretty broad and it can be hard sometimes to wrap your head around, but this is just kind of this look into the big system picture and understanding like, how can we have these conversations and how can we zoom out and look at things from the lens of feminist theory that looks at, um, systems of power that may be blocking us from moving towards healing and action. That's really important. So I want to focus a little bit on the science of hope, because I think hope is a really interesting topic when we talk about climate anxiety and action in general. So if you tell people that they're doomed and then yell at them for not acting, it's not really a winning strategy for change. There is a crisis of hope happening globally, and people are looking for permission to feel a sense of hope. I know I am, for sure. And I think that hope is a human need, right? So if you're not feeling hope, you're not okay. It makes us unique as a species because it allows us to conceptualize a future. So Dr. Rick Schneider proposed this hope theory, and he talked a lot about how hope is not optimism. So he talked about how you can use these building blocks to move towards hope in the future, and that a lot of that revolves around power and agency, which again goes back to this feminist narrative of like, we need to feel like we're in control of something. So most importantly, hope requires that agency. That's why it's a lot more effective for climate action. And hope also requires a truthful assessment of the problem. And anything that minimizes the problem isn't hope, it's bright-siding a situation and silver lining, and something that I'm very guilty of a lot of the time too. I used to think, oh, it's okay, like let's not look at the whole picture, let's be optimistic, but it actually negates a lot of the realities and doesn't motivate action because it's just sticking the head in the sand, that picture of or that the certain birds that do that, and they stick their head in the sand. They don't want to listen to what's going on around you. So hope theory argues that there are three main things that make up hopeful thinking. First one is goals, right? So approaching life in a goal-oriented way. And this is something that therapy can help you set up in terms of setting measurable and realistic goals. The second way is agency. So believing that you can instigate change and achieve these goals. It's really important to feel like you can do that and that you have that power. And lastly, pathways. So finding different ways to achieve your goals. And there's going to be more on this in a moment here, where you actually are going to have the opportunity to explore your unique pathway and what that means for you. Because climate action doesn't always look the same, just like climate anxiety doesn't always look the same. It's really individual, and it's important for you to explore what it means, like what it means for you. So I really like this concept of using hope in our narratives around climate work versus optimism. And there's so much agency behind having hope. So building on that pathway of finding your own unique way, we can also build upon this concept of finding joy in climate action. So again, I used to pride myself as being an optimist in a field that felt very painful. But optimism in the climate assumes a good outcome, when in reality, it's highly unlikely. We're dealing with some pretty big stressors here. But I also don't want to be closed off to the extraordinary and innovative solutions that are taking place right now and have been doing so for years. So one of my climate idols, Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, proposed this model of finding joy in climate action, and I thought it would be a nice thing to share with you all. So the climate movement often encourages us to vote, protest, donate, spread the word, lower our carbon footprint. The carbon footprint, by the way, was a term that was popularized by fossil fuel corporations in an attempt to place climate blame on individuals rather than systems. So, and while all these elements that I just named here, the voting and the protesting and the donating, all these things are important, many of us are struggling to find ways that we can contribute in our own unique ways. And then we're left feeling guilty for not doing enough, guilty for having too big of a carbon footprint, right? And so it's really important to tailor our climate action to our unique situation and the skills that we can offer as unique beings. So Dr. Johnson, poses this Venn diagram, and who doesn't love a Venn diagram? And these three concepts that she talks about are, first, what are you good at? What are your skills, resources, and networks that you have access to? Secondly, what brings you joy? So what are your sources of satisfaction and delight? Do you really like to be outside? Do you love to facilitate groups? Do you like to cook or garden or create art? What makes you happy? And what work needs doing, right? So what are some of the climate justice solutions that you've noticed are lacking, or maybe not enough people are working in that field? And at the intersection of these three things is your climate action. And so it doesn't need to look like anyone else's, because it's yours. This is your concept of how you find joy in this work. And so this is something that I really encourage you to think about. And if we had more time, I would love to have everyone kind of journal on this and think about their own thing, but maybe you can take a screenshot of this and just think about it on your own after this call. This can really be an interesting brainstorming activity too, for friends or for other community members, to sit down and think about what are your unique things that you can bring. So, quite possibly when you go through this exercise, you're already most powerful in your existing roles. So climate action doesn't mean you need to quit your job and become an activist and dedicate your whole life and time to this work. You might already have an existing skill set in an existing role that needs attention. So this model is really designed to encourage and facilitate change in every sector and in every community. And the more you can exist in the center of this Venn diagram, the better, because then you're creating and you're also contributing to your unique environment in the way that you know how to best. So I won't break out right now to get you all to try this, because I do want to make sure that we have a bit of time for questions at the end. But this is an interesting thing to experiment with and see where you can bring this work, because when we think about those emotions that we talked about earlier, the loneliness is a big one, right? So feeling connected to things, feeling connected to communities, that can really help also cope with the despair and the feeling of like not doing enough. It's also really important to consider that there are a lot of things that can be done. And also, there are a lot of responsibilities we have as humans. And sometimes it's hard to know where to begin. So, starting from joy is a really good place. Lastly, to kind of help combat some of that loneliness, there are so many resources for climate connection. I have a working document on my computer that is full of links and podcasts and connections and groups and articles. Sometimes I'm overwhelmed by it all, but I wanted to condense just a few for you all here that are really great organizations and networks that are doing really profound stuff. I'm also just going to quickly copy paste these links into the chat here so you can open up these. Oops. Did that change the view at all? Can you see things still, Jennifer? I feel like I clicked out of
It
this.
looks the same.
Okay, perfect. I just wanted to send this in the chat so that everyone has access to these links. But these are some of the really great websites and organizations that I have enjoyed and been a part of and continue to be a part of. So the Climate Mental Health Network was that organization that I talked about earlier. Lots of resources, trainings, and connection opportunities for folks. The Good Grief Network is a peer-to-peer support space for folks who are overwhelmed by collective injustices and eco-anxiety. They actually have like a grief program and a multi-step program for folks to sign up for and to work through some of the complex emotions that show up with discussions around the environment and climate. The work that reconnects is by a really wonderful woman named Joanna Macy, and this work really functions in inspiring and interactive group process for anyone who really longs to serve healing of nature and the world. Eco-Anxious Stories is a really cute resource too. There's tips and tools to share stories and normalize some of these climate anxieties and also to spark solutions. It's led by a lot of youth, and there's some really creative thinking in these stories too. Talk Climate to Me is also a resource that I recently discovered, and it's a really great program just to kind of start from the basics and get curious and have these conversations around what climate means. And it's a really fun and informative approach, and they run a couple sessions, information sessions throughout the year. Gen Dread or Generation Dread is one of my favorite newsletters too. It's run by a science communicator named Britt Ray. And she's a really wonderful ability of distilling a lot of this really complex climate talk into tangible and digestible information. And they have a newsletter that's free and it goes out every few weeks, and some really interesting interviews, resources, and videos and podcasts in that newsletter as well. And lastly, climate cafes. So climate cafes are a really great opportunity to come together and discuss in an informal, open, and respectful space to just share some of the emotions and the reactions that are coming up when we talk about these topics. So important to consider that these are containers. They're not therapy. They're not supposed to be solution-oriented. They are just a space for you to show up exactly as you are and talk about what's on your mind. And I've been lucky enough to participate in a few of them and was actually trained on how to facilitate them. And sometimes I really hesitate wanting to go, and then I show up and I'm so glad that I did, just because it's an opportunity to be in space with one another where there's way more conversation than what I'm giving you right now. This is very much just a talking at you experience, but the opportunity for climate cafes is for people to show up and just have a dialogue. So it's a space for exploring thoughts and feelings and emotions rather than what are we doing about it. Really get curious around what are we feeling about it. So with this, we wanted to offer the opportunity to actually participate in a few of these climate cafes. So I will be running 3 of them through Peak, and these are going to be just opportunities totally free or by donation for you to just pop in and have a space, a dedicated space to talk about some of these things. Especially as we go into the summer, there might be some things that come up for folks, especially as we're navigating different changes in temperatures of the summer seasons. So we're going to run one each month. It's just an hour, and it's always going to be from 1 to 2 p.m. PST. And I'll be there, and whoever else wants to show up. And it's really just a space to bring whatever is coming up for you and connect with community members and realize that maybe you're not the only one thinking about this. So we'll send a little information out to everybody after this presentation with these dates and times. But this is, again, just an opportunity to get started on finding support and getting curious about some of these topics. Okay, and then these are all my resources, and I just wanted to make sure that we had a little bit of time here at the end to talk about any questions or things that came up for folks while listening to me ramble on about this topic. But I just wanted to thank you all for showing up and for really getting curious about this topic. I know it's not easy, and there's a lot of things that come up when we think about it. And I just wanted to say that you're most definitely not alone in thinking this way. So thanks for carving out this little segment to come join me on this sunny day.